We'll be covering everything you ever wanted to know about choosing a dog food. 12 critical rules to evaluate pet food. If you have dogs or cats in your life, this information is for you. If you're a pet owner and you want to choose the healthiest food you can, one without any hidden dangerous ingredients, we will tell you how to do that. If you own or work in a pet store, this will help you show your customers what's in the bag and what those long chemical-sounding names on the label mean. Even if you feed a raw diet, the information here will help you make smarter food choices for your dog or cat. Most importantly, it'll help you separate the pet food marketing hype and the trickery from the truth. Understanding pet food labels. Pet food labels can be very confusing. Reading a label seems like a straightforward task, but pet food labels are nowhere near as clear as human food labels. When you read a pet food label, you've got to make some calculations before it makes sense, especially if you want to compare one food to another. The pet food industry is notorious for their confusing labels and vague ingredient definitions. There are strict industry regulations, but they don't tell you about the quality of the ingredients or the food. We've developed a little system that will make it easier to decipher pet food labels. We will teach you how to pick the best food for your pet. Evaluating pet food in 3 stages. The first thing you usually look at when you try to compare pet foods is the ingredient panel. I'll tell you what individual ingredients mean and what some hidden ingredients can tell you about the quality of the other ingredients. Then I'll explain how you can tell just how much of a particular ingredient is in the food. As an example, the American Association of Feed Control Officials, AAFCO, has no maximum requirement for fat, and a lot of pet foods are high in fat. There are also a lot of pet food companies that try to trick you into thinking there's a lot of an ingredient, when there's really just a tiny amount. I'll give you some handy calculations and guides to figure out if the food is as good as the manufacturer claims or if you're getting ripped off. Then we'll evaluate some real foods. Who regulates pet food? First of all, it's helpful to understand some background on pet food regulation. You might think that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration regulates pet foods, but that's not really the case. The FDA really just makes sure the ingredients in pet foods are generally recognized as safe and that the food is properly labeled. The FDA doesn't have the resources to regulate pet foods, so that task is left to AAFCO, the American Association of Feed Control Officials. AAFCO officials come from various organizations. Who are the members of AAFCO? Officials from FDA, representatives from states that follow AAFCO regulations, members of the pet food manufacturing industry. That last one is important because industry representatives naturally stand to gain from helping decide how AAFCO regulates pet foods. That's a conflict of interest, and it directly impacts what your dog or cat eats. AAFCO publishes guidelines and codes for pet food standards, plus lists and definitions of ingredients used in animal feeds. AAFCO regulates the words used to name or describe a food and its ingredients. This information takes up nearly 200 pages in AAFCO's official publication. You can buy it for $100. AAFCO is not an enforcement agency. AAFCO sets the levels of nutrients pet foods must contain and creates the measurement standards for pet foods. It also regulates the label claims and ingredient names pet food manufacturers can use. But this is another important point. What AAFCO doesn't do is enforce these regulations. Meeting AAFCO standards is completely voluntary. But if a company wants to claim its pet food is nutritionally complete and balanced, then the food and the label must meet AAFCO requirements. We'll go over the nutrient requirements. For now, let's talk about ingredient names. Quality standards, unfortunately, they do not exist. AAFCO only names the ingredients. They don't regulate the source or quality of the ingredients. So as long as a pet food company complies with their list of ingredient definitions, then AAFCO's happy. This means that in theory, the protein in a pet food could come entirely from something like feathers, which AAFCO allows. Not only that, but AAFCO nutrient requirements don't account for the availability of nutrients. So a pet food could contain protein that's not digestible or absorbable by your pet's body. So, because AAFCO doesn't make sure pet food ingredients are of high enough quality to provide your dog with all the nutrition he needs to build a strong immune system and fight disease, rather than just fill him up, you need to know how to decipher the ingredients in your dog or cat's food. Good diet is critical to fuel your dog's immune system and prevent chronic disease like allergies, diabetes, joint disease, and more. Nutrition is healthcare, but a lot of pet food companies don't look at it that way. Many just provide the minimum amount of nutrition to get by, and AAFCO makes it really easy for them to get away with that. I'll talk about that later. To analyze a pet food, you need to start with the ingredients and the ingredient label. The label lists pet food ingredients in order of weight, from highest to lowest. So the label doesn't tell you how much of any particular ingredient is in a food, it just tells you whether it weighs more or less than another ingredient. That causes a lot of confusion, and it lets pet food companies trick us into thinking there's more of an ingredient than there actually is. We'll talk more about this, but for now, let's start by dividing the ingredients into categories that make sense, so you can start separating the high-quality ingredients from the questionable ones. Ingredient categories. The first category contains the main building blocks of nutrition: protein, fat, and carbohydrate. They supply all the calories your dog or cat needs. Protein is the most important nutrient. Dogs and cats are carnivores, so they need a lot more protein in their diet than we humans do. And this protein should come from animals and not plants. Protein is made up of amino acids, and several of them are essential to your dog's health. His body can't manufacture them, so he needs to get them through his diet. Plants and grains are not a complete source of amino acids, so your dog or cat needs to get them from animal proteins. Next is fat, which is also an essential nutrient. Fats provide energy. They also support healthy cells, nerves, and muscles. They help the body produce some hormones, and they help your pet absorb the fat-soluble vitamins. But not every form of fat is healthy. The third nutrient is carbohydrate. Dogs and cats have no nutritional requirement for carbohydrate. AAFCO recognizes this. AAFCO requires a minimum amount of protein and fat in any pet food, but there is no minimum for carbohydrate. And yet most commercial pet foods average 40% to 60% carbohydrate, which is a lot of a nutrient that they don't need. Large amounts of carbohydrate can disrupt the delicate flora in the gut lining, leading to immune disruption and inflammation. Inflammation can cause many chronic health issues like allergies, digestive issues, diabetes, and even cancer. Carbohydrates can also cause weight gain because they cause insulin spikes, which prevent the body from breaking down fat. Other categories. Vitamins and minerals, what I call the protein quality indicator. Preservatives, then all the miscellaneous ingredients. I've come up with some rules for each category that'll help you identify ingredients you really don't want in your dog or cat's food. Protein rules. There are 3 quality rules for protein. Remember that plant-based proteins don't have a complete array of amino acids, but doesn't care about the source of the protein, so many pet foods have plant-based protein. Because animal protein is the most expensive ingredient in the food, manufacturers use plant protein to lower costs. So when you read a pet food label, you'll want to look for sources of plant-based proteins and avoid foods that use them. But keep in mind that if you're looking for a low-cost food, it'll be hard to avoid them. Animal proteins make the food more expensive. Some examples of cheap plant-based protein sources are plant meals, glutens, and proteins. Examples of plant-based protein: corn gluten meal, soy protein concentrate, soy protein isolate, pea protein. Any grain or starch that ends with gluten, protein, or meal. Protein rule number 1, avoid plant-based proteins. When you see any of these names on the ingredient label, stay away from that food because you know it's using cheap plant protein instead of the animal protein your dog or cat needs. It's harder for your dog or cat's body to digest plant proteins, and that can compromise his health if he eats these ingredients long term. Protein rule number 2. Animal proteins in pet foods are divided into meats and meals. Meats are added fresh and generally consist of muscle meat, tongue, and heart. So if you see chicken or lamb on the label, that means meat. But beware if you see chicken by product meal, beef by product meal, or the worse, meat by product meal or animal by product meal. These meals are different from meats because meals are cooked. By-product meals are of the worst quality. They are waste products from the human food industry and end up in rendering plants. Rendering plants vary in quality. The worst ones make meals out of euthanized horses, cows, roadkill, out-of-date grocery store meat still in the plastic wrappers, and even euthanized dogs and cats. Others are not as bad, but there are problems with even the better rendered meats. Rendering meats is like making a giant stew. They steam, cook the meat, drain off the fat, and dry the remainder into a powder. Protein rule number 2, avoid meals and byproduct meals. So, meats are a better choice than meals. The quality of the meat can vary, but in most cases, meats are better than meals from rendered meats because they contain more whole food nutrients. This same rule applies to byproducts. Meat byproducts are a better choice than byproduct meals. Byproducts themselves can also vary widely, because AAFCO doesn't distinguish between supernutritious organs versus intestines and fat tissue, and you don't know which your manufacturer uses. Protein rule number 3. Avoid generic protein. You always want your proteins to be named, so look for words like chicken, turkey, or beef, and avoid generic terms like meat byproduct meal or poultry meal. If the label says beef or beef meal, then you know it's beef. But if the bag says meat or meat meal, it can come from any mammal, including roadkill and euthanized livestock. This is poor quality protein, probably filled with barbiturates and other drugs. These generic ingredients are also a terrible choice for dogs or cats with allergies. Avoid poultry meal for the same reason. If it says chicken, it must be chicken. But poultry meal can contain any bird and is a poor quality protein source. So let's summarize the protein rules. The protein rules. Rule number 1. Avoid any food that contains plant-based proteins. Rule number 2. Avoid meals in most circumstances. Rule number 3. Avoid generic meats or meals. Fat rules. Fat. Rule number 1. Avoid generic fat. As I mentioned before, your dog needs fat as part of a balanced diet and for manufacturing hormones and absorbing the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. Once again, avoid generic sources. So you'll want to look for chicken fat or beef fat and avoid animal fat. Some foods will contain plant fats and the same rule applies. Look for specific plant fats, such as flax or olive oil, and avoid the generic vegetable oils as these will be low-quality oils. Fat rule number 2. No fish oil. This one might surprise you. Never feed your pet a food containing fish oil. Fish oil is very fragile. It oxidizes and turns rancid when it's exposed to oxygen, heat, and processing. If there's fish oil in a pet food, especially if it's a dry diet, you can virtually guarantee it will be rancid. And if it's not, as soon as you open the bag or can, it will be, and it will become more and more rancid every time you open that bag. Even chicken fat will become rancid within a couple of weeks in most kibbles. Carbohydrate rules. Carbohydrate rule number 1. Avoid grains and legumes. This could be the shortest rule of all because dogs and cats have no nutritional requirement for this nutrient, so there's no need for it to be in the food. The easy rule is just avoid all grains and legumes. But there are 2 problems with trying to do that. The first problem is that we want cheap foods, and carbohydrate is cheap. The other is that kibbles need starch to hold them together, so most kibble is at least 30% carbohydrate, and some contain as much as 50% to 60%. But if you can only afford kibble, read on to Rule #2 to learn a bit more about carbohydrate quality. Carbohydrate rule number 2. Choose whole grains. Rule number 2 is look for whole grains. Most of the nutrients are found in the bran layer, the fat, and the endosperm of grains. When grains are processed, these nutritious parts are removed along with their nutrients. The remaining parts that go into your dog's food may be just waste or floor sweepings. So if you don't see whole in front of the name, like whole oats, whole grain brown rice, or whole millet, avoid the food. The carbohydrate rules. Rule number 1, don't feed them. Rule number 2, if you must, then look for whole grains and avoid the waste products. Vitamin and mineral rules. There's just one rule here. Avoid foods with lists of vitamins and minerals on the label. I'll go into a lot more detail here because the information in this section is vital for your dog's health. The heating and processing in kibble making causes significant nutrient loss. Here are some examples of nutrient loss from cooking and drying. After the heating and processing dry pet foods go through, they wouldn't meet minimum AAFCO requirements for many vitamins and minerals, and they wouldn't allow your dog to survive without some serious chronic disease. So these nutrients have to be added back in. But when the manufacturers add these nutrients, they use synthetic vitamins and minerals. This is very bad for your dog, so I want to provide more detail about synthetics. Synthetics? Synthetic means made in a lab and not in nature. Most vitamins and minerals are produced by pharmaceutical companies, not food companies, because they're not food. So why is that a problem? It's because synthetic vitamins and minerals don't act in the body the way their natural counterparts do. Just like wearing a right-handed glove on your left hand, they look the same but don't fit because they're a mirror image of natural vitamins. They're exactly the same molecule, but flipped over. Synthetics are fundamentally different from their real food counterparts, and the body knows it. Sweeteners are a good example of how right and left-handed molecules are different. Sugar is a right-handed molecule that the body can digest and use, but artificial sweeteners contain left-handed sugar, which is completely indigestible. They taste sweet to us, but the body doesn't find any nutrition in them. The exact same thing happens with vitamins. The natural form of vitamin E is called the D form, but the body doesn't use the mirror image L form, it just excretes it. So you'll often see DL-alpha tocopherol in pet foods, which is a combination of the naturally occurring D form and the synthetic L form. Research shows risks of synthetic vitamins. Research shows that synthetic vitamins don't work the same way as natural vitamins. In one study, rats ate a very high-fat diet that was deficient in vitamin A. They divided these rats into two groups. The first group got beta-carotene, which is synthetic vitamin A. The second group got an extract of whole carrot. The beta-carotene group developed eye disease as a result of the vitamin A deficiency, while the rats who got the carrot extract didn't. In another study, rabbits were fed a diet deficient in B vitamins, causing cirrhosis of the liver. When the rabbits got synthetic B vitamins, the supplements didn't prevent the disorder, but adding yeast, a natural source of B vitamins, did prevent the condition. Research shows risks of synthetic vitamins. The 1996 beta-carotene and retinol efficacy trial is an even more frightening reminder of the unpredictable nature of synthetic vitamins. In this study, researchers tested whether beta-carotene and retinol palmitate, which are forms of vitamin A, could reduce the risk of cancer and death. They followed nearly 20,000 participants who were at high risk for lung cancer, such as smokers and asbestos workers. They planned to run the study for 8 years, but they halted the study 21 months ahead of schedule because there was a substantial increase in the incidence of both cancer and death in the group taking the synthetic vitamins. If your dog or cat eats these synthetic vitamins every day, he's relying on them for his survival, because there aren't enough nutrients in the food itself to sustain him. As you saw from the research, it could be a losing battle. So the rule for synthetic vitamins and minerals is to avoid them. How do you find them on the label? You look for the chemical names because that's essentially what they are, chemicals. In the handout you'll be getting, I'll put all of the common vitamins and minerals in their own category so you can identify them on the label, and hopefully avoid them. And that's the rule for this category. Avoid foods that rely on these synthetic substances for nutrition. But nearly every pet food on the market breaks this important rule. Even some raw food diets are fortified with synthetic vitamins and minerals. But you can find foods with whole food nutrition that don't rely on these chemicals. There are 2 kibbles I know of, Nature's Logic and Carnivore, that don't use synthetics. Some Acana and Origin formulas also have limited synthetics. Canned foods without synthetics include Nature's Logic and Tripette. You'll also find a wide variety of raw diets without these chemicals, including Answers, Pet Food, and Steve's Real Food. This isn't a complete list and it's not an endorsement, but you need to know that you can and should avoid synthetic nutrition. Remember the one important rule for vitamins and minerals. Protein Quality Indicator Rule. You'll remember that plant-based proteins have an incomplete array of amino acids and that heating and processing can cause nutrient loss. So, if a food contains free amino acids in the ingredients, that's a pretty big indication that the proteins in the diet are incomplete. The amino acids you'll most commonly see on the label typically start with an L, so you might see names like these: L-arginine, L-lysine, L-cysteine, L-carnitine, L-tryptophan, L-methionine. What does the L stand for? It's the left-handed molecule of the right-handed real amino acid. So, just like synthetic vitamins, these are chemically processed fake nutrients. One example is L-cysteine. Most of it comes from China, where they collect duck feathers on farms, plus human hair from barbershops and hairdressers, then process them in factories. Preservative rules. This section clarifies some misleading terms the pet food industry uses to describe preservatives. Canned and raw diets don't typically have preservatives, and that's a good thing, but dry diets can sit on the shelf for months or years, so they need preservatives to maintain whatever nutrition is in them and to stop the fats from going rancid. The bag itself is a big part of this because some bags even have preservatives sprayed into their lining. In many cases, the bag costs more than the ingredients inside it, so never take the kibble out of the bag and put it in a storage container because it will oxidize and go rancid much faster once it's out of the bag. There are two categories of preservatives: synthetic preservatives and the so-called natural preservatives. Synthetic preservatives. The main function of preservatives is to slow down the oxidation of the fats in the food. The most effective antioxidants are the synthetic ones, but they've all been linked to cancer, and you should avoid foods that contain them. Preservative to avoid: ethoxyquin, BHA, BHT. Rule number 1 is to avoid any food with these synthetic preservatives. Natural preservatives. Then there are natural preservatives, like vitamin E or mixed tocopherols, citric acid, and calcium propionate. Although the pet food industry calls these natural, we know they're synthetic. Rosemary oil is another example, but while it looks natural, they use solvents like acetone or methanol to extract it. So, while these are certainly safer than the scary synthetic antioxidants, they're not whole foods and they are chemical in nature. Rule number 2 is to avoid even these natural antioxidants whenever you can. Fruits with citric acid. The healthiest option is to choose premium pet foods that stabilize foods with real fruits that naturally contain citric acids, such as cranberries, blueberries, or apples. But remember, the more natural the preservative, the quicker the food will oxidize, so don't buy giant bags that will last your dog months. Try to use the bag up within 2 weeks to avoid too much oxidation and nutrient loss. Rule number 3 for preservatives is to choose foods preserved with real fruits. Summarizing the rules for preservatives: Rule number 1, always avoid synthetic preservatives. Rule number 2, avoid the so-called natural preservatives whenever you can. Rule number 3, look for foods that use the real fruit preservatives, but use the bag quickly. All the other ingredients. The last category is everything else on the label. This might include probiotics or other random ingredients. I'm not going to discuss them here, but you'll find them all in your handouts, with some information about each one. These are the categories of pet food ingredients and the rules you need to apply to each one. Dividing the ingredients this way will really help you see what's inside the bag. You'll now see the real quality of the ingredients, so you don't have to rely on pretty packaging and tricky pet food company claims. Part 2. Quantity of ingredients. Now that you know the 12 critical rules for evaluating the quality of pet foods, let's talk now about the quantity of the ingredients in the food. That's important because you want most of your dog's calories to come from protein, and as few as possible from carbohydrate. Because dogs and cats have zero nutritional requirement for carbohydrate, AAFCO doesn't require a minimum or a maximum amount in food. So pet food companies don't have to tell you how much carbohydrate is in the food. But there's a way to figure it out, and I'll tell you how to do that. But first, I want to talk about the guaranteed analysis on the label. Let's cover the guaranteed analysis on pet food labels. AAFCO requires pet foods to show a guaranteed analysis on the label. They have to show at least the minimum amount of protein and fat, the maximum amount of fiber and moisture. The company might choose to show more nutrients, but AAFCO doesn't require it. But the analysis doesn't show you how much of any particular nutrient is in the food for 2 reasons. First, because pet food companies only have to guarantee a minimum amount and not the actual amount. Second, because the amounts on the guaranteed analysis are as fed, so a food could be 50% fat, but say 10% fat on the guaranteed analysis. The label just has to show the minimum amount. AAFCO doesn't set maximum amounts for most nutrients. They're really just concerned that the food has the minimum amount a pet needs to get by without obvious signs of disease or malnutrition. Meeting minimum AAFCO standards isn't a sign of optimal nutrition. It's really just minimal nutrition. And here's another complication. The nutrients on the guaranteed analysis are as fed. But the AAFCO minimum requirements are usually done on a dry matter basis. That means all the water in the food has been taken out of the calculation. Most kibbles are about 10% moisture, so if you compare the guaranteed analysis on 2 different kibbles, you can get a fair estimate of what's inside. but you can't directly compare a dry diet to a canned diet. Canned diets contain a lot more water, so the guaranteed analysis will show much lower amounts of protein and fat as fed. So to compare diets, you need to convert the nutrients on the guaranteed analysis from an as-fed basis to a dry matter basis. Let's use a practical example and calculate the protein amounts of a couple of different foods, one kibble and one canned. Protein example, kibble. Here's an example of a popular food from a big box store, Blue Buffalo adult chicken and brown rice recipe. To calculate how much protein is in the food, use this formula. Protein calculation. The guaranteed percent of the protein divided by the percent of dry matter, then multiply by 100. First, we need to figure out dry matter. 100% minus moisture percent equals dry matter. The moisture is 10%. So for this food, the dry matter is 100 minus 10 equals 90% DM. The protein as fed is 24%. So the calculation is 24 divided by 90, multiplied by 100 equals 26.7% protein. So this food has enough protein to meet the minimum for both adults 18% and puppies 22.5%. This food would almost certainly cost more than grocery store brands because protein is the most expensive part of the diet. Cheaper brands use less protein and may not have enough protein to meet the minimum for puppies. You can do the same calculation for fat. Using the same Blue Buffalo as an example, first take the dry matter of 10%. The fat on an as-fed basis is 14%. So the percentage of fat on a dry matter basis is 14 divided by 10, multiplied by 100 equals 14% fat. What about carbohydrates? Remember that AAFCO doesn't require companies to show carbohydrates on the label, so they don't. So you have to do even more calculations to measure the carbohydrate content. There are some limitations to these calculations. We'll get to that in a bit. If the ash content isn't listed, use 7% for kibble and 1.5% for canned diets. Those are averages. Again, let's use the same Blue Buffalo adult chicken and brown rice recipe. The protein is 24, the fat is 14, the moisture is 10, and for ash we'll use 7 because it's unlisted. 24 plus 14 plus 10 plus 7 equals 55, 100 minus 55 equals 45% carbohydrate. That's a lot of carbohydrate when your dog has no requirement for carbohydrates. Even after all these calculations, it's important to realize that the only thing you know for sure is the weight of your dog or cat and the weight of the food. Everything else is speculation because of the minimal label requirements. When you calculate protein and fat, the number you're getting is the minimum amount because that's all the pet food company tells you. So there could be more protein and fat in the diet. In the case of protein, it's probably not that likely. Protein is expensive, so they probably won't add more than what you think you're paying for. But there could definitely be more fat, especially since AAFCO has no maximum for fat. So because the protein and fat are minimums, when you calculate carbohydrate, you'll get the maximum amount. This doesn't mean you shouldn't do this calculation, but just be aware of the limitations. Protein's the most important ingredient for dogs and cats. I mentioned it can come from animal sources or plant sources, but that the array of amino acids in plant sources is incomplete. So if you see free amino acids on the ingredient panel, that's a good indication there are plant-based proteins in the food. But I want to talk about meats versus meals because this can really confuse a lot of people. Most pet owners know that animal protein should be the first ingredient in any pet food. And it should really be the first and the second ingredients. It's one of the first things most people look for on the label, and that's good. But pet food companies can trick you into thinking there's more protein in the food than there really is. So this rule is important. You know that pet food ingredients are listed by weight, from highest to lowest. But that's not exactly true, especially in dry diets. The ingredient weight is measured when it's added to the food. And while some ingredients like meats contain water, which is quite heavy, others like meals are already dried. And water weight makes a huge difference to protein. Here's how they trick you. As an example, here's a bag of IAM's Proactive Health Adult Large Breed Dry Dog Food. You'll see that chicken is the first ingredient. The guaranteed analysis shows, after our calculations, it contains 25% protein on a dry matter basis. So you might be thinking, okay, that's reasonable, but there are 3 issues with the protein in this food, or 4 if you count the fact that there's not enough protein, even though it meets minimum AAFCO standards. When you see chicken as the first ingredient, you'd think the protein in this diet is mainly from chicken. but you'd be wrong. Chicken is 70% water by weight, and again, the ingredient panel lists ingredients by weight when they're added to the food. But this kibble will end up as a dry food, and most of the other ingredients are also dry. So let's assume that when this food is made, they add 40% chicken, 25% cornmeal, 15% sorghum, and 10% chicken byproduct meal, 5% barley, and 5% dried beet pulp. This breakdown is completely hypothetical because we have no way of knowing it, but it's probably not too far off from reality. The chicken contains water, but all of the other ingredients are added dry. So once the kibble is processed and dried, the chicken loses 70% of its weight. So if chicken was added as 40% of the ingredients, then the amount of chicken in the final product after drying will be 30% of 40, which is only 12%. So this food can say chicken is the first ingredient, but when you take out the water, there's actually twice as much cornmeal. And cornmeal is used as a cheap source of protein. If you look further down the ingredient panel, you'll see there are free amino acids to compensate for the lack of meat protein. There's L-lysine, D-L-methionine, L-tryptophan, and L-carnitine. So this is an example of a food with very little animal protein in it. The main ingredient is really cornmeal after you account for moisture, but IAMS can list chicken as the first ingredient and make the food look better than it is. They can also trick you into thinking there's more of a particular protein than there really is. Let's look at this bag of Merrick grain-free real rabbit plus chickpeas recipe dry dog food. You'd expect rabbit to be the main source of protein in this food, wouldn't you? So let's see if that's the case. Looking at the ingredient panel, you can see that rabbit is the first ingredient, but we can't stop there. Just like chicken, rabbit is 70% water by weight. So once the food is processed and dried, 70% of the rabbit ingredient is gone. So let's use a hypothetical example and assume that the food has 30% rabbit, which contains water, 25% turkey meal, which is already dried when it goes in the food, 25% lamb meal, also already dried, and 20% pork meal, already dried. Now again, this breakdown is hypothetical. But once the water's removed from the rabbit, it will end up being 9% of the food, which is less than all the other animal proteins listed on the ingredient panel. This food is sold as rabbit recipe, when turkey is the real first ingredient, and possibly lamb is the second. This is nothing but trickery. It meets a technical AAFCO definition that will fool consumers every time. Let's summarize what you want to look for on ingredient lists. Protein. Make sure protein is listed as the first two ingredients. Avoid any food that relies on plant-based proteins. Avoid meals in most circumstances. Avoid generic meals, byproducts. Carbohydrate. Don't go looking for them. Look for whole grains. Keep the carbs below 30% for dogs, 15% for cats. There's a lot of trickery going on in the pet food industry. The marketing uses buzzwords you're looking for, such as grain-free or natural, and then they manipulate the details so you'll buy their food and not a competitor's. Who really makes it? And on that note, here's something you probably don't know. Most pet food companies don't even make their own food. Even some foods from the big brands are manufactured by third-party companies that churn out thousands of pounds of dog food. So most pet food companies are really just marketing companies. Keep this in mind and don't trust what the companies tell you about their pet foods. There are some small ethical companies and I urge you to support them. But remember, they're not making their own food and they have to rely on the co-manufacturer to tell them the truth. And the co-manufacturer has to rely on the companies that supply their ingredients to tell the truth as well. There's a lot of room for things to go wrong. So the better you become at reading pet food labels, the safer your dog or cat will be. So most pet food companies are really just marketing companies. Keep this in mind and don't trust what the companies tell you about their pet foods. Dog food ingredient panels function very similar to our human food ingredient panels. Unfortunately, most pet parents have no idea what those ingredients are, good or bad, or what they are feeding their pets. Marketing is at the highest level, along with decades-old brand recognitions that have always represented pet food. As an example, Milk Bones, dog biscuits that have been utilized for generations. Who knew that they are one of the worst treats you could possibly feed your dog? As indicated previously, just like Kleenex is to tissue, dog chow is to dog food. Everything listed in this ingredient panel in red is at the very least inferior all the way to carcinogen. America's best-selling dog food. Now you can understand why our dogs are so sick. Notice the kcal amount. We will talk about this later. With real salmon, really? Ground yellow corn, chicken byproduct meal, corn gluten meal, whole wheat flour, animal fat, salmon, rice flour, soy flour, sugar, propylene glycol, meat and bone meal, water, tricalcium phosphate, soybean oil, animal digest, salt. Beneful was recalled a few years ago due to dogs becoming ill and even dying from ingesting phenobarbital. This was due to the protein sources coming from rendering euthanized animals, including dogs and cats. Remember, Purina is the largest philanthropy to everything dog. Dog shows, dog training, dog breeding. Like vets, breeders are not nutritionists. They have somehow gained this high threshold thinking they know all about nutrition, even having new puppy parents sign contracts pertaining to their food. The blind dog and service dog vendors do the same thing. You cannot raise a puppy or receive a service dog unless you feed what they say. This ensures Purina's bottom line. So you just paid thousands of dollars for this puppy and you want me to feed this? It's literally a slow poison for them. Chicken, corn gluten meal, brewer's rice, animal fat. What kind of animal? Poultry byproduct meal. What kind of poultry? Buzzard, whole grain corn, corn germ meal, fish meal. What kind of fish? Animal digest. I'll leave this up to your imagination. And fish oil. Goldfish. Chicken cornmeal, ground whole grain sorghum, chicken byproduct meal, dried beet pulp, chicken flavor. Then look a little lower. Fructooligosaccharides. A nutritional supplement that is becoming more popular? I'm sure it is popular with the corporate giants in the industry. Improves digestibility? How about just incorporating higher quality ingredients rather than more chemicals? Breed-specific dog food? So I'm curious. Do they make a Labradoodle food too? What should that dog eat, half poodle and half Labrador food? See how low the kcal amount is? This means you will be required to feed more, so you can come back and buy more sooner. The English Bulldog is probably the most problematic breed that we deal with. Over the past 100 years, we have destroyed these dogs through reckless breeding. So now let's feed them the most inferior food we can possibly produce. Again, the Mars Corporation lacks any morals and is only chasing the highest profit that they can achieve, even though your dog will be suffering as a result. Medium-grade foods. Although there are many, literally hundreds of dog food brands, can they survive on any of these foods? Sure, they can, but at what cost? Our opinion is that as pet parents, we should be feeding the very best that we can afford. Not everyone can afford the very best, but there are decent foods that are affordable, but most will not make it into Ben's Marketplace.
Nutro.
Deboned lamb, whole brown rice, rice bran, lamb meal, split peas, powdered cellulose, chickpeas, pea protein, whole grain oatmeal, dehydrated alfalfa meal, dried plain beet pulp, natural flavor. I always tell the customer, I'll leave that up to your imagination. Natural Balance Limited Ingredient Diet LID. New formulation, dried sweet potatoes, venison, pea protein, potato protein, canola oil, preserved with mixed tocopherols, natural flavor, decalcium phosphate, salmon oil, flaxseed, potato fiber, calcium carbonate, salt. Today's cat and dog owners are becoming more savvy than just a few years ago. They're starting to pay attention to food labels because they want the best for their animals. So they read the labels and they choose foods that they believe will give their pet a long and healthy life. Taste of the Wild manufactured by Diamond Pet Products. Costco's Nature's Domain is Taste of the Wild in a Costco bag. Buffalo, lamb meal, chicken meal, sweet potatoes, peas, potatoes, canola oil, egg product, bison, roasted venison, beef, natural flavor, tomato pomace, potato protein, pea protein, ocean fish meal, salt, choline chloride, dried chicory root, tomatoes, blueberries, raspberries. Remember, everything below salt is less than 0.7%. Grain-free pet foods. A recent trend is the move toward grain-free dog foods. By tracking retail pet food sales, GfK reports that grain-free dog foods saw a 28% spike in 2013. We see the growth of grain-free foods and natural pet products generally as part of a larger trend toward humanization of pets, said Maria Lange, Senior Product Manager of GfK's Retail and Technology team. Consumers are clearly comfortable splurging on pets they see as valued family members, not just everyday animals. And that's where it all goes wrong. Pet food companies are recognizing our desire to move away from harmful grains. And why wouldn't we? An overwhelming percentage of dogs suffer from yeast and skin disease. Yeast is a fungus that's always present on pets as part of the normal flora of the body, both internally and externally. When the immune system becomes depressed or when the dog is fed starchy foods, the yeast will proliferate in the hair follicles and throughout the body. So pet owners with itchy pets want to keep them off harmful steroids and are rightfully looking at their pet's food as a potential cause. Pet owners now know that grains feed yeast, and with the explosion of itchy pets these days, pet food companies are making a lot of money by selling them grain-free foods. But here's the kicker. Yeast and allergy symptoms aren't caused by grains. They're caused by starches. Starches are complex carbohydrates that turn into sugar when metabolized in the body. Do you know what yeast loves to eat? Sugar. Starches are found not only in rice, corn, and wheat, but in potatoes, peas, sweet potatoes, all of those ingredients found in grain-free foods. You see, there's one really big problem with kibble. They can't make it without starch. That starch is not only cheap to source, but it's necessary to hold the kibble together. Without starch, your bag of grain-free dog food would be a bag of dust. Roz is prepared with dehydrated meat proteins. Ingredients: salmon, pea protein, pea starch, peas, olive oil, miscanthus grass, natural salmon flavor, flax seeds, decalcium phosphate, potassium chloride, citric acid, preservative, tricalcium phosphate, salt, one of the very top dry dog foods available. Carnivore venison. Ingredients: venison, venison liver, eggs, ground organic sprouted barley seed, herring, perch, salmon, sweet potato, ground fava beans, ground organic sprouted flaxseed, ground organic sprouted lentils, ground organic sprouted peas, potato starch, apples, carrots, sea salt, kelp, baking soda. Nothing else. Carnivore is probably the top dry kibble in North America.
This has been a very brief overview of the dry pet food industry, the good, the bad, and the ugly. These corporate giants also control the canned food as well. The worst is the prescription pet food, which we will cover in another video.